Okay, so we are now going to talk about sculpture in the classic period of Greece. Hang on, sorry. There we go. Okay, so I want to start this off with a little caveat because I've had a few students ask me about this kind of to the side, usually occasionally in the middle of class in a discussion. And I know people are curious about this and feel awkward asking about it, so I just like to start off talking about classical Greek sculpture by addressing the tiny penises. Okay, so I have a lot of students who have been curious about this over the years, and I'm just going to explain it to you because we're all adults here. So the ancient Greek ideal man was not this idea of this lustful person, okay? And so this idea about what made an ideal kind of hero man at the time in ancient Greece was a little bit different than some of the ideas that come along later. So I'm just going to quote directly from this classics professor. Greeks associated small, non-erect penises with moderation, which was one of the key virtues that formed their view of ideal masculinity. And that's from Andrew Lear, who has taught at Harvard and Columbia and NYU in classics departments, so he obviously is kind of an expert in the field. There's the contrast between the small, non-erect penises of the ideal men, which is like in ancient Greece, the heroes, the gods, the nude athletes, etc., and the oversized, erect penises of satyrs, which are the half-goat men who are kind of drunkards and very wild and lustful, and various non-ideal men in ancient Greek, which is basically anyone who isn't Greek, okay, who they kind of call barbarians, elderly men, things like this. They often have large erect penises. So it's actually like a negative thing in ancient Greek society. So if you're going to be an ideal man in the ancient Greek view, you should be portrayed with a small non-erect penis because it means that you can control yourself. Okay, so this proportion becomes the norm for artists for centuries to come, because all the way up through the Renaissance and Baroque periods, way later, they start copying classical Greek sculpture. So if you look at Michelangelo's David, disproportionate to the rest of him, disproportionately small, non-erect penis, same thing. He's copying from the ancient Greeks and Romans, and the Romans just copied the Greeks. So that's what that's about, and now you don't have to be curious about it anymore. So you're welcome. Okay, let's look at some sculpture. So this sculpture is arguably the most influential and important one that we will look at this semester. And a lot of times when I tell people that in seated classes, they're like, why? Why is this one so important? And I will tell you why. This is the Critios boy. It's from the Acropolis in Athens. It's not very big. It's 2 feet 10 inches high, so just under 3 feet high. But it is posed in this revolutionary way, which is the Contrapposto stance. I know what you're thinking. He has one leg slightly in front of the other. Why is that revolutionary? We saw that with Egypt. We've seen that with all of the archaic and Daedalic sculptures. Why is this one different? Okay, the reason this one is different is when we look at the archaic sculptures, which we're copying what the Egyptians were doing with their sculptures, where they had one foot slightly in front of the other. They're very stiff. So their shoulders are totally straight, they're stiff, their hands are to the side. They're not very naturalistic at all. And the reason for that foot being forward that the Egyptians had was symbolic, right? It's showing that they're stepping forward into the next life, into the afterlife. So in classical sculpture, this sculpture is the first one that we identify with this contrapposto stance. And what that means is a more naturalized stance. Instead of being really stiff and rigid and arbitrary, this guy's kind of standing with more of his weight on one side than the other. His hips kind of tilt, his knee is slightly bent, his whole body is just much more naturally posed. And this is because in the classical period, sculptors get very interested in human anatomy and get very interested in naturalism and in trying to portray the body as it looks in the actual real world, trying to make the marble look more realistic and less stiff. So they're very interested in these subtleties, subtle shifts in stance that change the posture of the body, and in expressing that in marble sculpture. So that is why this is an important sculpture. And contrapposto stance is one of those words that you might want to remember because it's the kind of thing that will pop up on your final. Okay, so let's look at some more examples. These are warriors. They were found in the sea. They were fished out of the sea. They're made out of bronze. They're larger. They're 6 foot 6 inches tall, each of them. And you'll notice they are both in contrapposto stance, right? So they continue this Critios boy investigation of human anatomy and of how shifting weight slightly in this more naturalized way to stand that is less stiff affects all the musculature in the body and how the body is posed. You can see they both had some kind of attribute. They're called the warriors. They could also have been, one of them might have been like Zeus or Poseidon or something, but we don't have the trident or staff or whatever they were holding. They could have also just been warriors holding spears. We're missing a lot of context because they were literally fished out of the sea. But you can see that these are less stiff, more naturalized. If you look at the way the musculature and the way the body is posed, it seems more realistic, right? More naturalistic. And we see a continued interest in that in the classical period. This is a pretty famous sculpture. You may have seen a reference to this in pop culture before. This is this Discus, which is the Discus Thrower. It's by a sculptor named Myron. And this is actually a Roman copy. The original was made of bronze in 450 BC. This is true of a lot of things. The Romans copied a lot of Greek sculptures, which is why we still have very accurate references to them that we can look at. But a lot of the ancient Greek sculptures were lost, were destroyed over time. So in this one, we can see how this is kind of a continued investigation. So we're looking at a naturalized pose, we're kind of exploring it further, and then the next idea with this interest in the human form, and remember at the very beginning, I talked about how the Greeks were very interested in humans as kind of the measurement of things, particularly things in the natural world and how things relate to the human body. So this further investigation into the human form is something that we see really take off in the classical period. So the next thing is to look at athletes in these really complicated poses. Try holding your arm up like that for a long time. Then imagine holding a really heavy discus like that. Very difficult pose. But the artist, Myron, is interested in what the body does, what the musculature looks like, what all the ligaments, you can see all the straining ligaments and veins and things in the arm do in this complicated athletic pose, and is trying to portray this very naturalistically and really do a comprehensive study of the human anatomy in this athletic pose. And this becomes kind of a big thing. It becomes a big focus in classical sculpture. So this brings us to Polyclitus, who is a really important sculptor from this time period in the classical, early classical. So he is someone who has that interest in aesthetics and in kind of standardizing things. So making like an order to follow to achieve a great sculpture, to create a great, beautiful and perfect sculpture. So he writes this thing called Canon. This particular sculpture is one of the most copied sculptures of all time. This particular one sat in Pompeii. It's a Roman copy of the sculpture that was in Pompeii. It's 6 feet 11 high, so it's quite tall. And so Polyclitus wants to examine this idea of beauty. And he epitomizes this intellectual rigor that we really associate with the classical sculptural design. Like many of these works, the original is lost. Like I said, this is a Roman copy, but this copy stood in the Palaestra of Pompeii. We'll talk about Pompeii later when we get to Rome. But the Palaestra is like, it's like a gym or a school where people go to study wrestling, like Greco wrestling. So this stood out in front of this gym as like an ideal. Like this is what you're supposed to look like if you're an athlete. It's called Doryphorus, which means spear bearer, so he would have originally been holding a spear. And this is a model for athletes to aspire to. It is Polyclitos' version of the ideal statue of a male nude. And it was actually made, the original was made as a demonstration on this subject of the ideal proportions and the ideal balance within sculpture, the ideal human ratios of the human form. So Polyclitos calls this thing Canon. That's what his writing is called, and that's really what the title of the sculpture was, because it was a demonstration of it. Why? What does canon mean? Canon with C-A-N-O-N, not with two N's in the center. So not like a gun, like a big gun. So if you're a fan of like Star Trek or the MCU or something, and you see these debates online of what is canon and what isn't, canon is something that follows the original story, the original design, the original intent of the people who created it. Whereas like fan fiction or something is outside of the canon, non-canonical, okay? The reason those things are called canon means the original and the kind of following the rules of the original, is because of this sculptor. It's because he wrote this piece called Canon. And it was basically a list of rules for how to make the perfect sculpture and what the perfect human proportions are. The manuscript has been lost, but we do have copies, excerpts from it written by Galen, who was a physician during the 2nd century. And he talks about it like this. He says, beauty arises from the commensurability of parts, such as that of the finger to the other finger, all fingers to the palm to the wrist, and of these to the forearm, and forearm to the upper arm, and in fact of everything to everything else. What does that mean? Proportions, okay? So he's talking about the proportions and the ratio of the relationship of each part of the human body to the human body as a whole. And so Polyclitos sets out what these ideal proportions are to create the perfect human specimen as a sculpture. Obviously, this is sort of problematic to think about now, and really then as well. But this was his intention, setting out and kind of mathematizing basically beauty and this idea of aesthetics. He called this a system of chiastic, which means balance or cross balance, the balance between the ratios within the body. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and next we're going to look at the Acropolis. All right.